our panel discussion today will be facilitated by Dr. Paul Wangeman, who is Assistant Director of the Center for the Improvement of Teacher Education and Schooling here at BYU. He will lead this part of the discussion and will give us directions as to how those who have questions directed to the panelists may address them. So, Dr. Wangeman.
Thank you, Barry. It's a wonderful opportunity both to hear from our speakers today and then now to interact with them. We have opportunities to ask questions about the topics or themes which we selected for our conferences. For example, civic virtue, what is it? Why is it so important? Civic purpose, what role would that play? But then more specifically, this question of how do we prepare young people for citizenry? How do we help prepare students, young people, to accept responsibility associated with citizenship? How do we develop this willingness to participate? And so we would hope that a number of that there's no limitation to your questions of this panel, that we feel that they're very prepared and able to help us think about these kinds of questions and issues, from the larger theoretical ideas to the more practical daily implementation issues. So we've asked Pam Sua from the Jordan School District, first of all, to ask some questions related to work that she's directly involved with and in her school district. And then following that, we have a roving microphone, and so if you want to just stand up, raise your hand, we'll get that microphone to you and you can ask the question of the panelists. Again, I express appreciation for all of our speakers, their willingness to continue on in this discussion, for Dr. Matthews to continue to connect with us through Skype, and Anne Colby to join the panel as well. So Pam, we'll look to you, and then I'll just look for a raised hand and bring a microphone to you.
Thank you. I represent social studies in the Jordan School District, and so all of your research has been so interesting today. And Dr. Damon, we used your Failing Liberty 101 in our group that we facilitate teachers and administrators. We got some great discussion, but it seems like it's all up here. It's hard to bring it down, and how do you actually do it with our students? But my question today, all of our social studies courses have standards that talk about student deliberation and developing political efficacy in students. And as I go out and look in observe their classes and watch them teach, even if teachers have read the research, many of them resort to lecturing in PowerPoint. So my question would be, do you have suggestions? What can we do as teacher education faculty, as district central office administration? What can we do to really help motivate and prepare our teachers to teach in this way?
I would say the first thing that you may want to do is have your teachers engage in the process that you'd like them to see in the classroom. If it's a more deliberative model, then engage them in deciding and reflecting on the implications for their instruction. We've also found that sometimes time is a barrier or planning is an issue, and so crafting some time to plan those types of experiences, I think is important for teachers as well.
I can add to that just a little bit. I have looked at pedagogies for teaching civic and political understanding, motivation, and skills. And, in general, I think all of us who are educators know that what you really have to do, no matter what you're trying to convey, is show what the expertise is, get the kids to practice exactly the kind of thing that you want them to be able to know and be able to do, give them informative feedback, and let them practice it again. So every single pedagogy that we've seen used effectively is a version of that and requires thinking through, first of all, much more concretely and specifically than people usually do, what the goals are in the area of understanding what exactly do you need them to understand, be able to use later, be able to explain to someone else, what aspects of motivation exactly are we trying to promote, and what skills specifically do they need to practice. So in order to get that to happen, the range of pedagogies that I've looked at include deliberation, which we've talked about a lot here, and of course there are a lot of different strategies to use in the classroom for deliberation. But we also looked at a bunch of other pedagogies, and they can be used in combination, they can be used differently for different disciplines, and they vary in their labor intensiveness and so on. So some of the other ones are action projects, political action projects, which are really useful, especially for older kids, to actually develop their own plan for political action in small teams or small groups. And these can often are on local issues and that are not particularly ideologically divisive. And then to write about and communicate about that action. Political and civic research projects, so that they, and I think I would include creating these source books and so on as part of that, in which they learn a tremendous amount and have to put it together in a highly skilled way. Simulations of various kinds. I think Stacie mentioned simulation, but thinking through what all the various simulations are. One that's quite well known nationally is Model UN, which is, I think, when it's well done, can be incredibly effective for kids. But there's lots of different kinds of simulations that can be used. Placements, we haven't said much about service learning. I find that service learning is one of the most labor-intensive kinds of things that people do, and other kinds of placements related to that. But if you have the right kind of support, and if you have the right kind of relationships with institutions, it can be something where, for example, I saw a case of students studying family policy who had placements in family court and in various other kinds of family-serving institutions, and they learned a tremendous amount about not only the formulation of policy, but the gap between formulation of policy and implementation of policy, which is something that reaches a level of sophistication that most young people have never really thought about, and gives a much greater sense of the complexity of the issues. And then, of course, reflection, which is part of service learning, but can also be used as structured reflection. And there's lots of different strategies for doing this, of course, but it can be used in conjunction with any of the other strategies. Oh, the one I forgot is speakers. Having speakers come in, and often when you have speakers who are not terribly different from the students themselves, but who come from similar backgrounds, or even young people who've become very productively engaged with issues and then come in and talk about it. All of these things can be done poorly and done well, but each one can be done well if it's prepared for. And so for the speakers, for example, the really good uses of this involve the students learning about the topic area prior to the speaker, attending, formulating their questions, writing it up afterwards, sometimes having a series of speakers over time on the same issue with different points of view, and that sort of thing. So I guess what we've encouraged in the work that I've done is to use a wide array of pedagogies and to really think hard, much more concretely and specifically, about the relationship of the pedagogy and the fine-grained implementation of the pedagogy in relation to the very specific kinds of goals for learning that you have in your classroom. So that's mostly what I've written about on that topic.
That's great. Well, the one thing I have to add to those very good and complete answers is just a comment that teachers that are lecturing about something are assuming that what students need is to hear or learn about some information that can be imparted through just telling them the facts or telling them what they need to do or know. And especially in this area, what's important for participatory democracy is the development of practices, of actual capacities to organize and to do things, and also attitudinal things of wanting to contribute, of having the kind of purpose that I mentioned. And so teachers, it's important that teachers understand this and understand that this is really what is expected in this area, not something that students can just learn by sitting in a room digesting a lecture, but by actually doing stuff or practicing stuff or trying stuff out or making a contribution. And I think that's why the work that we heard this morning from the Kettering folks is so valuable, because it really focuses on that, and having Kettering and organizations like that behind that give some weight to it makes it kind of an authoritative expectation, because I think that if teachers are going to get the message, and not only get the message, but sort of feel permission to focus in this way on developing practices among students, there's some leadership issues that are important. There needs to be strong leadership at the school level, at the district level. Superintendent have to authorize, in a sense, teachers to do these kinds of pedagogical strategies that are unconventional, that are more active and practice-based.
I'm looking for my microphone. Is there? Do I have one here somewhere?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Let me share with you something that I learned as a teacher. I've taught history for more than 20 years, and I spend a lot of time now lecturing at, or teaching classes with other institutions. Guests drop in, and when I'm talking about deliberation, I try never to use the word, because it comes across as some kind of specialized technique like brain surgery that I have to learn. When I walk into a class, I'll ask students, did you ever make a really bad decision? And they will kind of shamefully grin and say, well, yes. I said, well, tell me about it. Well, I thought I ought to do something, and I just did it. I didn't talk to anybody. I just did it, and it was the worst thing I've ever done. Then I'd say, did you ever make a good decision? Oh, yeah, I made some. What did you do? Well, I looked at the things that I might do, the options that I had, and then I'd think about, well, if I do this, what might happen that I might not like? And I'd talk to my friends, and I'd say, what do you think about this or that or the other? Never use the word deliberation, but in fact, that's an accurate description of the exercise for the faculty of judgment, which we all have, and we all use it every day, okay? The difficulty is that we don't necessarily use it in a political setting and with other people. That's the only thing that's strange about it. So as Stacie said, one of the best ways I've seen teachers learn to get out of the dependence on lecture is just to put them in a situation where there's an issue that they deal with. Teachers do things other than teach. They are citizens of communities. Take a community issue and give them some choices and give them the experience of trying to make that decision. Then they understand deliberation because they feel it at their fingertips. They know what it is. And that's been most helpful. The other thing I wanted to say, the guy on the screen with the pixels didn't talk enough about what he meant when he said decisions are difficult because they concern what's really most valuable to us or what's right for us as a community. A lot of confusion around that, and I'm saying valuable, not values, because what we've observed when people try to make decisions, they will consult the political equivalence of what Maslow was talking about when he said, you know, people have some basic drives. We all want to have food, right? We all want to have shelter, right? We all want to have water. You don't have to coax people into doing that. Their survival depends on it. Our political survival depends on three things, among others that are, first of all, we want to be able to do whatever we think we need to do to make sure we do survive. You might call that freedom or whatever, but I want to be able to do what I have to do if I'm going to survive. What we want to do to survive is to make ourselves secure from danger, right? So we, just as we love food and we love water and we love shelter, we love the ability to do what we need to do to survive. We love the security that comes from being able to protect ourselves from danger. And most all of us want to be treated fairly. You meet very few human beings that don't want to be treated fairly. And so what we observed when people were trying to make decisions on choices about a policy or about what to do about anything, they would return over and over again. They would say, is this going to make me more secure? Is this going to some way impair my ability to do what I think I need to do? Am I going to be treated fairly or unfairly? Okay? And the difficulty, the reason we have to do it, since we all agree on those things, the controversy or the difficulty comes not because we disagree, but because we value much the same things, but we have different experiences, we're in different circumstances. If I live in New York, I probably am going to give up some of my personal freedoms in order to be a little bit more secure. I'm from Alabama. In my little town in Alabama, we're not too worried about terrorist threats, okay? So I'm probably going to opt a little bit more to, you know, to be free to do what I think I ought to be doing, and I'm not going to be too keen on collective security. So we differ because our circumstances and our experiences and our conditioning. But the wonderful thing that people learn when they try to exercise good judgment is that even though they may not have the same experiences and come to the same conclusions as other people, they care about the same things. And once they recognize they care about the same things, the tone of the conversation changes, and that makes it possible to solve problems. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pam, for the very practical question, and now we'll open it up to any other question. Just raise your hand and I'll bring this microphone around.
Hi, is this on? Most of the comments seem like they would be most appropriate for older students, like middle school, secondary school age kids. What about in elementary school? What can be done with the younger kids, even as young as kindergarten age students?
There are some very basic, I guess I'd call them virtues, even in preschool years, that that certainly set the stage and act as developmental precursors for the kinds of citizenship I think that all of us would like to cultivate in young people. And they would include things like service, the idea that, and this is something I've written about in some of my earlier books that I think gave me a reputation of being... excuse me? Oh, I'm sorry. Practices like that used to be called, when I was a kid, chores around the house. The idea that that in a household, at a family level, young kids can do things that actually contribute to the benefit of the household. And not only that, they're kind of expected to every now and then, whether it be something like helping shovel the snow, or helping feed a pet, or water the plants, or making their own beds. And some of this, I mean, it's kind of interesting again to see cultural changes in this. As the society's become more affluent, it's become, I think, sometimes not very thoughtfully seen as just these are additional burdens on kids, that if we can afford to relieve them of these burdens, then that frees the children up to do things that are more important to them, ranging from school kinds of things to play to that, and so on. But even though this makes me sound old-fashioned, I always say that, to a certain degree, that kind of expectation of some sense of obligation to somebody beyond yourself, which can be begun very early in life. A 4-year-old can take on some responsibility. It adds pride. It gives them a sense of competence. They can do something. And sometimes it might seem a bit like drudgery. And I'm not at all suggesting that kids should be, become laborers or anything like that. But just the idea that kids can contribute to a family, to a school, and that there is a collective society, even though the microcosm might be a family, or it might be at the level of a classroom. There is a collective society that is a privilege to be part of, that gives us a lot, that we benefit from, and that we can contribute to. So these are the kinds of early ideas and practices and habits that we can and I think should cultivate in young children.
I would just add a little bit about, I think some of the main skills that especially that Stacie and Dr. Matthews have talked about are really relevant from the beginning, partly for the reasons that Dr. Matthews was just saying, that they're fundamental to being humans, that have to do with fairness, that have to do with cooperation between people, and taking responsibility for your part in the group, and also having sort of fundamental respect for other people and for the good of the group as a whole. And all those things, I think there are specific kinds of things that early educators do that help support the development of these skills and virtues that can translate directly into civic participation later. Perspective taking, seeing that your point of view is not the point of view, it's a point of view, and that sort of thing, I think, directly links. And I also think, kids this age are not too young to be engaged with specific community issues, and simple things like recycling, or in our area, there's a drought that's quite bad in California, and so kids, it doesn't matter how young they are, they can start thinking about how to save water, and that fits in with the idea of your own responsibility and your own capacity to contribute to the solution of a larger problem.
Just to add on, the habits and norms that you establish in your classroom that are directly linked to our roles and responsibilities as citizens, they start very young. I often tell the story of when I was about to throw an apple core away, and my 4-year-old said, "Mommy, stop." And I said, "What?" She said, "You're about to throw an apple core away." And I said, "Yeah?" She said, "You should compost it." And really it's because that was the way that they they dealt with that issue in their classroom. So I think that thinking about our roles and responsibilities and the norms that we live by, and when children are very young, obviously we need to be more explicit in explaining to them why we do things the way we do as a community. But they can also begin being treated as thinkers and problem solvers. I have a colleague named Dr. Myrna Shore who has a program called I Can Problem Solve, and it's for 4-year-olds. And it's all about this perspective taking and thinking about problems in different ways and working with others to solve them. And there's many other things like that. But elementary school that I work with has a constitution for the school, and the students develop it. They have a Bill of Rights that's posted, rights and responsibilities, and they make sure that they revise that every so many years so that every student has that experience of going through that process of contributing to those rights and responsibilities. And then they use that, again, to teach about our own rights and responsibilities as Americans. So anyway, I think that, again, I agree with everything that everyone said here and think about modeling it.
Yeah, we've seen beginnings of an experiment at Kemp Pierce with kids who are, just barely above infancy, because human beings do seem to are social beings and they're political beings, and this instinct for working and relating to others in an ethical way seems to be evident at very, very early ages. So we're watching those experiments very closely.
I can just use my teacher voice. Can you hear me? So I'd like to know, what do you see as the future? David, can you hear me better now? I'd like to know what you all see as the future research questions, maybe the questions that aren't being asked but that ought to be asked.
That's going to take.
Me, were you asking that for me?
All of you.
Go ahead.
Well,
Yeah. Oh.
Here's the way I understand teaching. When I'm in the classroom, it demands of me the greatest creativity and innovation with which I'm capable. When I teach the class on Monday and come back on Wednesday, I realize I've got to do something different. It seems to me that teaching is essentially a creative craft, right? Now, what worries me is that we have somehow managed to make teaching and the whole schooling enterprise the most bureaucratically bound, rigid enterprise that you can imagine. Do this, don't do that. In part, it comes from schools, and in part, it comes from methodologies. Do this, do that, do the other. It doesn't seem to me that that's very conducive, I would think, for those that do on schooling and teaching, how we liberate the teachers to practice the craft with the kind of imagination that it requires. Some of that, no experiment will succeed perfectly. But as Charles Kettering used to say, that the thing that innovators have to learn how to fail successfully. And I remember one teacher telling me one time, I don't have the permission to fail. I don't, that's not something I can do. But unless we give teachers greater latitude and school systems greater latitude, we're not going to achieve the potential that we could achieve.
That's great. I would bring in something in addition that's beyond the school, which is the question of what to do about all of the social media and online fascination that this cohort of young people have. And there are a bunch of questions about this. One is just what difference it makes to human relationships, that now a lot of them being conducted via text messages rather than even email. Even email is old-fashioned now. It's all texting. So one is just a basic question of how that's affecting young people's capacity to carry out face-to-face relations and then ultimately relations to the civic society generally. But then to bring in the school, what can and ought schools do about this? And is there a way to use and to channel these new technologies for the kinds of goals that all of us have? And there's got to, I mean, as a matter of faith, I believe there has to be, but we are just at the, and some of it, I mean, there is iCivics, there are definitely people beginning to swim in these waters, but it's at a, you know, Marshall McLuhan always used to say, whenever there's a new medium, it begins by absolutely emulating the old medium that it replaced. So when TV first came along, it was just a bunch of radio shows that they put on TV, and it took them years before they figured out how to produce an actual TV show that took advantage of what television can do. And I think that's the lesson all of us have to learn as we use these technologies. First, we're going to do things, use online technologies just to do stuff that looks like the old stuff. But ultimately, it's going to be a fascinating research endeavor to figure out how to make the most out of the strengths of these new technologies. So that's what I would put on the table.
I'd say I'm also interested in questions related to technology, and I'm interested in the concept of blended learning and civic education, and how one can use a combination of online activity and classroom tech activity to support the development of civic virtues.
Well, might as well throw in one more topic. People have alluded at different points during the day to the issue of power. And I think the two key issues with the civic learning are why should someone take the effort to be involved, and how can you be involved in a way that's competent, effective, and responsible? And I think one part of that answer, the answer to both those questions that hasn't been addressed very much in research yet, has to do with power. And I think a young man named Eric Liu has done a lot of work on this. And his point really about the motivation especially is that the real fundamental reason for that could potentially be the most convincing of all for young people about why to get involved has to do with self-determination. And do you want to have a say? Do you want to have any power to influence what your own life will be like and what the life of the setting that you're living in and your kids are going to be living in is going to be like? And so how do you claim power in a constructive way that actually will make a difference and that will make a constructive difference? And that's a question that I think is just crucially important, that hardly anyone has really focused very much on that issue of power. And it goes all the way through the system in every possible dimension, from the local all the way up and internationally and every other thing. So I think that's an incredibly rich topic, both educationally and in terms of research.
Next question. Gary always makes me work hard.
I waited till you were on that side. I'm not sure how this will be posed as a question, but it's kind of a challenging reality that we, in public education, live in a very political context. We have elected boards of education who originally by design were nonpartisan, and as they begin to be more and more directed toward the ideology of political groups, tend to be looking toward that ideology to be the people who control the direction of school districts and school district policy. I think the question I've got in terms of your work is, when you have this place called school where we're trying to help children and young adults learn how to be civic-minded, there are critics who oppose the kind of instructional practices that would have them look at an issue within the community even. So maybe the question is, how do you respond to the ideologies that tend to be fairly extreme and aggressive if you're trying to look at a new way? Some of the extreme ideologies look at old style of methods in instruction, in fact. And it just seems to be a real challenge to get to the level we need to get to in terms of building this civic virtues and the understanding of tolerance and some of the other things that come along with that in a climate where the ideology may be very unhappy with that kind of work and trying to figure out ways to restrict that kind of activity within a public system.
I know that Dr. Matthews probably has something to say about this. I'll add my 2 cents. I think that schools, the school curriculum, my understanding of the research of a community has always, or there are many examples in history where it's been influenced by the ideology of the community, right, or political context or whatever. So I think that that's a reality, and I think that we need to think about how we can engage our communities more effectively in really thinking about the purposes of education. Sometimes the ideologues are the loudest, right? And so there may be a sense that we really can't engage this topic on a deep level. But the research of the Kettering Foundation has found that when you bring just everyday citizens together, not the people who are the talking heads, and you ask them what matters to them in education, and you ask them to sort of grapple with some options for focusing our education for youth, often there is a diversity of ideas that come up, and those ideological, issues, while they're there, they're not the only things that our communities want from their schools. So I think finding ways to reconnect the community as a whole, not necessarily the voting apparatus, those elected officials, to what's happening in schools matters, and putting this forth as a challenge, that people can then start to look at all the issues that are at play. I mean, what's going on in Colorado is a prime example. I don't think that there really is a deliberative process going on there, and it might help if there was.
We've watched Americans deal with really tough issues for 35 years now. And our overwhelming sense is that the American people are essentially pragmatic. That they don't come in red, white, and blue, or pink, or gray shades. They're just folks. And the problem is that the political system is polarized for certain understandable reasons. There is real profit in the polarization. For example, somebody observed we've gerrymandered the system so now that the politicians select the voters rather than the voters selecting the politicians. So that there's no incentive, if I've got a constituency that's going to vote for me anyhow, for me to talk to anybody other than that constituency. It also means I've got to do what that constituency wants. I've got to stay close to my base. Then the media picks it up And now a balance is the most extreme point of view on one side and the most extreme point of view on the other, and that's supposed to be balanced. Well, what that leaves out is the practical common sense, you know, it may not be perfect, but let's get on with it and see if we can't solve a few of these problems, America. So I think the comforting thought is that the American people themselves are not as red and blue as it seems to be. I don't have any problem with strong advocacy and ideology. If people feel like they're not getting what they want, they're going to emphasize it and advocate it and very strongly. What the difficulty is the immobilization of the political system. I'm not going to only play my checker, but I'm going to put my thumb on it. You can move all of yours, but I'm not moving from here. And the other side does the same, and that just ends the game. And we've got to get past this. That'll teach you to ask questions because you get really long answers.
Long answers are beneficial. I want to preface my question with a reminder that in '78, when Alexander Solzhenitsyn spoke to the Harvard graduating class, he titled his talk, "The Exhausted West." And he was talking about a spiritual exhaustion in the West. He acknowledged that he had come from one of the most repressive political systems in the world and was now blessed by being in one of the freest political systems in the world. But then he asked the question, what have you done with your freedom? And in addressing who's going to get involved in the political process, he said, the way you treat people who run for office is so uncivil, is so demeaning. Why would anybody worthy of being elected to an office decide to run and go through all that, right? So my question is, in our work with junior high and high school students or whatever audience you want, maybe not counting elementary, although I've been educated by what you said can be done at the elementary level, how do we model anywhere or do we teach anywhere how to respond civilly to incivility in person and online?
Some of the other panelists should respond. I have a view, but your turn, Bill.
Well, certainly, I mean, that's a great question, and it's there's nothing more tempting to respond to than responding to incivility with even more incivility. And anybody that's experienced road rage, which I have to confess to experiencing every now and then, at least quietly, knows the temptation that you just sort of, oh yeah, that guy did that, well, I'll show him, or something like that. So I think this is a real problem, but my approach to it would be to use role models. Anne and I have just written a book about some exemplary political leaders of the 20th century, and one of them is Nelson Mandela, who, when he was inaugurated as president, had on the platform with him the guard who guarded him in Robben Island for part of the term of his very unjust imprisonment. And that was a gesture of great civility and forgiveness, which Mandela was an astonishing exemplar of, and to great political effect, I'll say. He was also a very effective leader of South Africa, as anybody that's seen the marvelous film Invictus, which I recommend, will know. And so my approach would be to bring to life people like this in the classroom. And I think students are fascinated by these real-life stories, because if you bring them to life, you bring them to life as human beings. These are not saints. They're not a different species. They're also people that have had their problems and their issues. Mandela, for example, as a young person, was pretty violent. He was actually an angry young man, and learned a lot in the course of his life about how to be a great leader. And so you can do it in a way that young people will relate to. You don't have to teach them as perfect, cardboard, idealized figures. But if you bring these stories to life as human stories, I think that I know that young people can find them inspirational, and there are lots of cases of this of leaders that have demonstrated these are also positions of faith, Christian faith positions, and so on. So that would be my approach.
I guess I actually have written quite a bit on how to support what we call open inquiry, open-mindedness, deep interest and respect for opinions different from your own, both at the institutional level, at schools and colleges, and in the classroom. But what I'd actually like to say in response to this question is that I think there's a difference between citizens being civil and respectful and so on, and campaigns using incivility as a campaign strategy. And I think as citizens, I feel like we need to band together to make sure that campaign strategy doesn't work. And I agree with Dr. Matthews that most people are pragmatic in the end, and I believe that if those strategies very clearly did not work, they would drop down in their prevalence.
A story from a community that I saw having real problems solving its problems. Very divided, divisive community. Couldn't pass its levies for its schools. Bad race relations. Elected officials in jail because they couldn't tell the difference between their money and the public's money. And I watched this meeting deal with the question, who's not in this room that needs to be in this room? They'd stop there, it would have been a demographic answer. But they went on to say, who's not in this room that needs to be in this room if we're going to solve this problem? Well, they went through the usual suspects, the mayor and the police chief, and finally they realized it was the crank down the street, the fellow with the bad attitude, the person who wouldn't cooperate with anything, who was opposed to everything, okay? So they said, well, why is he not in this room? They said, well, we didn't invite him. They said, well, if we'd invited him, would he have come? They said, no. They said, well, what room is he in? And how can we get in that room? Okay? I think encouraging respect and civility is a great thing. But our observation is that when people realize they need one another, if they know they need one another to get something accomplished, okay, they will be at least modestly civil, right? Simply because they need them. They can't solve the problems without them. And so this recognition that we need other people seems to be missing in too many cases because they don't look like us or that we don't like them, or there's some other reasons that we dismiss them. But in most cases, we really need them. And when we recognize that, we have an incentive to be at least modestly civil.
I would only add that being civil in the face of incivility requires some pretty sophisticated social and emotional skills. And so self-regulation, awareness of others, even some communication skills. And I think that our schools, as we're moving toward, all of our focus on academics, can easily not spend time teaching those types of skills to kids and engaging them and practicing them and recognizing them when they demonstrate those skills. And those are all a piece of being prepared to respond civilly in the face of incivility.
Great. I know we're nearing the end of our time for this panel discussion, but I would like to ask the question then of all four of you. Are the public schools the right place for us to be looking as a solution to, or as a means to improving civic virtue, civic participation in our society today?
I'll just say one sentence about that, which is that they better be, because we're really never going to have a society without that the majority of our young people are not going through the public schools. There are wonderful independent schools, there are great schools of faith, there are charter schools, which are also public schools of a type. But I don't even, I've never even heard of the most utopian social reformer or school reformer that thinks that somehow you're going to be able to educate the majority of the population through the public schools. So we need to work with and for the public schools in this country. It's a part of our democracy. It's part of the original mission of education, and of course we should allow lots of other alternative venues, but the public schools probably are the hardest places to work with, in the sense of getting things to work on scale, because there's so much going on and there are so many people involved, but they're absolutely essential to get that right, I think.
Well, I'll just be quick. Yes, for the same reason Bill said, it reaches the most people, has to be done with a high level of creativity and professional acknowledgement of teachers, as David said earlier, but it can't be the only one. And it seems like you need many institutions joining in on this effort, and I'm glad that Kettering is one of them.
And I would add to what the two before me have said, is that it's important to note that while our teachers are our civic educators, there are a lot of other civic educators in our communities that can support the work that our educators are doing, and that can be partners, particularly in the active civic pedagogies that for secondary students can be most valuable. So I encourage schools to think about opening their doors to these partnerships that with community educators focused on youth civic learning.
To echo what has already been said, I think the focus should be on public education, not just public schools. Public schools are one institution of public education. There are a great many other institutions. The community itself is an educator, particularly in developing the civic attitudes of young people. I think the greatest progress could be made in reconnecting the public schools to the larger world of public education. I'm afraid that they too often have become isolated from that larger community from which traditionally they have drawn their strength. There's an argument that the community co-producing education provides the necessary reinforcement to the work of institutions like schools. That argument won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. I think it's a pretty good argument.
Excellent. Any final question from the audience? Great. Barry?
We certainly appreciate all who have participated in our conference today. We appreciate those of you who have been in attendance this afternoon, and I would invite you to join me in showing an expression of appreciation to our presenters and our panelists today.